It's a pleasure to be with you all today and a pleasure to follow Pete Peterson. We have been in this territory together for nigh on to 30 years, I believe, Pete. And one thought, I'm going to focus much more on the breakdown at the how we're not trusting one another as well as our institutions. But as Pete was speaking, it brought to mind a little known quote by Thomas Jefferson that I will obviously not say it exactly like he said it. But essentially he said, the best public policy recognizes both the value of the knowledge of experts and of the wisdom of common ordinary people from living their daily lives. And I think everything that Pete said was addressing how do we now do public policy in the 21st century that does integrate and balance expert knowledge and the wisdom of ordinary people living their lives. But if you pop up my slide, my title, I'm going to focus on with you today on trust and truth, fundamental to civility and democracy. We've all watched, and it began literally in the late 70s, early 80s, this big breakdown between public and trusting institutions, coming to an nadir in 2013, as Danielle said, when Congress was trusted by only 9% of the people. And people used to kind of joke and say, and what are those 9% paying attention to? But since 2013, that trust has dropped not only between us and our institutions, but between each other. If I were going to say the two things that I believe are the most seriously broken and the most needing our attention in this time of a really, truly existential threat to our democratic institutions and to our culture of civility and respect, it would be trust and truth. And fundamentally, I think the most difficult one for us to deal with is the issue of we now live in parallel universes in terms of where people go for their information and what people treat as fact. Danielle spoke quite a bit about the commission's focus on knowing that this has to be built back up. We have to come to a place in our society in which we again put more intent on the importance of truth and facts. But in order to do that, we're going to need really significant regulation of how social media operates, not just here, but globally. But most of us will not be players in that arena. So on the truth side of the agenda, our focus in the commission and what we see beginning to build up in communities across the country is the way in which we innovate and reinvent local media sources that people, no matter where they are on the political spectrum, actually replace their trust and confidence. And I think as state officials, from the resources that you have available to you, doing a kind of mapping of your state in terms of where are there vibrant local media sources that actually are trusted by the public. We always talked about food deserts in communities of low income or people of marginalized backgrounds that didn't have access to decent food. Well, we're now talking in terms of huge swaths of our geography of people who do not have access to enough information about how their state government works, about how their local government works, to have confidence in following a story, to know, to trust the facts that are presented. So I would invite you in this Civic Health task force to commit some time, invite some people who've really done this. Elizabeth Green, in the work she's doing for education on Chalkbeat. I've forgotten his name, but the very famous New York Times reporter who left and has started a media outlet dealing only with criminal justice issues. And I can find that and get it to your team. But look at who's really doing this work and how can we as state officials join with the work to ensure that we don't have news deserts or news areas that are so overwhelmed by misinformation, disinformation, that by definition, you cannot expect the public to make reasonable decisions if they do not have information. Shifting to the trust side, Pete did a wonderful job of particularly the focus on public engagement in policy development. So I actually wrote this third strategy in our common purpose report. It's deep in my bones. For years, I've led organizations that were all about local, state, and national government, ensuring that citizens were at the table. I'll put in the chat the name of my book. It has all the principles for design. It has all of the concrete examples of how to do high quality public engagement. But when I moved to the National Institute for Civil Discourse, which I did in 2012, I led that organization through this period of time when we watched civility and respect be further and further and further degraded in our culture, to the level that it's a crisis, to the level that through many social media outlets, you see a larger preponderance of communications that are based on disrespect, on vilifying, on demonizing, than you actually see on messages that are based on a capacity to both tell the truth and build each other up in how we might find common solutions to problems facing our community. So on the trust side, acknowledging again how important the policy is, and it's where I've spent most of my career, I'm going to spend my time with you around how do we deal with the reality that in many communities across this country, I'll stop and tell a personal story. Post 2016 presidential election at the National Institute of Civil Discourse, we began to get thousands of people, tens of thousands of people reaching out to us via email, social media, and believe it or not, picking up the telephone and making a call to complete strangers. That doesn't happen much more in our world. One call I'll never forget was from a mother in New England. We have two daughters. They're both enrolled in Ivy League schools. They're coming home for Thanksgiving. One voted for Trump, one voted for Clinton. They haven't spoken to each other since the election. How are we going to have a decent Thanksgiving? Well, anybody who's tracked that call for help at Thanksgiving has only gotten larger and larger and larger. The breakdown in our churches, the breakdown in our workplaces. I think, given my own background, lots of years of corporate consulting before I went into the public sector, the biggest surprise to me was the first call I got from a major US manufacturing corporation in this country, who this is exactly what he said to me. And now this is in late 2017. Since the 2016 election, our most important product development teams have lost productivity. They have not been able to redevelop the trust that creative breakthrough product development requires, and that these teams had previous to November 2016 in this period since, because they can't step back over the chasm of you voted for Trump and I voted for Clinton. So we actually found ourselves providing services to the private sector as well as churches and nonprofits and communities to, okay, how do you back up to actually rebuild trust between human beings when it is this broken? Next slide, please. I hope that whatever else I may have said today, that you'll take this slide away with you as a foundation for doing the work to rebuild trust across broken relationships in whatever context you are working. Human beings are social beings. We respond to the context we're in, the structure we're in, and the signals we receive in that structure. I understood how profound this was long before, while I was still doing America Speaks. The last large-scale event we did in the country was in 2010 on debt and deficit. We had 3,500 Americans demographically represented of the country, located in 19 cities across the country, all spending 7 hours to take on the task of cutting $26 trillion from the US debt by 2025. The Congress had a task force that was supposed to accomplish the same task. The 3,500 citizens we had in tables of 10 around the country accomplished the task, but not to begin with. In the morning, when Berkeley and Harvard did a survey of our 3,500 participants, all of the political conservatives, self-named, did exactly what their ideology said. Under no circumstances will I raise taxes or fees. The liberals all said, under no circumstances will I cut spending, particularly for the entitlements. It took about an hour and a half of the data that was at their tables, of the ability to call experts to their table across the political spectrum, as they came to the place of discovering what I'm seriously going to say to you, a bright fourth grader understood in about 10 minutes, that you can't solve debt and deficit in the US without both cutting spending and raising taxes. At the end of the day, I told you, they solved the problem. But when I testified to Senate Budget Committee, to House Ways and Means, to the President's Fiscal Commission that July, and you can still see this up on YouTube, I actually said, I do hope that this never happens. But if we were to put a little chip in the finger of those 3,500 people who solved this problem in June, in November, when they've listened to hundreds of millions of dollars worth of negative advertising based on ideology, and they go to the voting booth, they will revert to form. And that's exactly what happened. The 2010 election produced the large minority group in the House called the Tea Party, which meant it was not possible for John Boehner as Speaker to actually come to some agreed upon compromises with the Obama administration. Now that's a pretty dramatic example, but I really want to make the point. The same human beings in the context of a safe, fact-based situation where they knew they were heard and understood, they came to one decision. When put back in the political frenzy of an election, they made a different decision. Same person, a mere 5 months in between those two behaviors. The same process happens to people when they come to town meetings. Usually the way we set up town meetings actually exacerbates people's divisions. This is the wonderful things involved in teaching, like Pete was talking about, how to organize a town hall so that the context pops people out of their pre-existing ideas and opens them up to a true dialogue and exchange with people different than themselves. In order to create the space for people to come away from those deep divides, step number one is to ensure that you design the space so that they meet one another as human beings. And please just pop it back to all of us seeing each other. We ran a project at NICD that became a television documentary called Divided We Fall. In that context, we brought people together who were very strong pro or very anti-Trump voters. But the first hours they spent together, they had no idea who they voted for. They just met each other as human beings. Very, very quickly in that process, they began to discover that we have more in common than separates us. And yes, on the policy issue, in the end, I may support the wall and you don't support the wall. But we don't need to demonize each other because we hold that different policy position. And this is something that elected officials, that senior people in public manager positions, you can design those opportunities on tough public policy issues so people meet first about values, vision, or as Pete called it, what do we want to be true of the place we live? And when people start by defining those kinds of issues with each other, the conversation takes a whole different turn. What's critical is to learn how to create both the invitation, and this is very tough in communities, because particularly marginalized populations aren't going to be comfortable coming to the same geographic locations where people of more privilege have previously always been comfortable. So even in choosing the location of the public meeting to review a possible policy decision, think about and be creative. Danielle said this, libraries work in a lot of communities as better places for those meetings than City Hall. Convention centers that have been equally accessed no matter what your income level is or what your color is. Churches in communities are sometimes better public spaces. Community theaters. So be creative even where you invite people to have these conversations in which what you know to get to where you want to go, to find the best policy to support the most people in your jurisdiction, people have to feel safe, they have to believe their voice will be heard, and they have to know they've made a difference. Danielle hooked 2 words that we tried to hook in every one of our recommendations in strategy 3, strategy 4, 5, and 6. Yes, we want public engagement and we want public empowerment, because it is, I know that I have to be heard, and I want to know that being heard made a difference. I don't know, Carl, exactly where I am on time, but I think I probably should be wrapping up. Can you give me a head nod? Is that true? Well, let me then just close with a favorite quote of mine from the founder of, or the first president of the League of Women Voters, who, by the way, are great allies in this kind of democracy work in your states. We have to remember, and particular when we are under this much threat of our core democratic institutions and our core democratic culture. The success of democracy doesn't depend on a few persons who do great things, but on many persons who do small things faithfully. To accomplish what you want to accomplish as elected officials in the state, you need literally thousands of other citizens in your state to faithfully engage in small steps, supporting civility and democracy faithfully over a long period of time. Thank you very much for having me.